Quite a few years ago, I went hunting with my dad for deer out in Wyoming, and we were in the Little Bighorn Mountains, and this was long before I came back to the church, so I really, faith wasn't part of my life. But I remember in that trip, it wasn't like the Rocky Mountains, but you'd have these big climbs up these hills, and you kind of had to work on it, and you were, at elevation, so you were tired and sweaty, and you get up to the top of the mountain or top of the hill, and you look out, and it's just amazing. You just see the scenery, and it's a great way to really appreciate it. And even at that time, I appreciated God's creation. And on top of these mountains, you feel, a closeness to God, really, that you can't see, that you don't feel other places, just because you see the grandeur of everything that He did. In our spiritual journeys, we call these mountaintop experiences. It's something that we use to kind of describe our journey through life. Sometimes we're on top of the mountain, we're really close to God, and we just feel these spiritual consolations all over, and we know that we're on the right path, and we know that everything's great. And then there's journeys through the valleys, too, where we feel a little more distant. Things don't look so good. We're in the thicket of the woods. We're, trudging through rough brush, and, it's just a different part of the journey. God's still there, we're still present with Him, but it's just a different view. It's something a little, like I said, a little more difficult in the times that God isn't necessarily as visible to us. All we see are the trees and the hills and the things that we have to climb. In the gospel today, we hear really about an ultimate mountaintop experience. Peter, James, and John were called by Jesus to the top of a high mountain. And there, He's transfigured before them. He shows them His glory. His face is like the sun, and His clothes are like light. He gives them a glimpse of what His true being is. Gives them a glimpse of His being as God. And He does this to give them hope. And then within that appearance, we have all of a sudden Moses and Elijah come. So we have basically all of salvation history, the whole Old Testament coming and proclaiming that Jesus is God, and He gives us that great glimpse. And Peter is so amazed. He's like, we want to stay here. We want to build these tents. We want to build places to worship, and we want to remember this forever. And then as they're coming down the mountain, Jesus says something. It's always odd to me when Jesus tells His disciples things like this. He says, "Do not tell the vision to anyone until the Son of Man is raised from the dead." Could you imagine Peter, James, and John having this experience? And I would want to tell everybody. It's like, wow, you should have seen Jesus. This was amazing. But He says, don't tell anyone. So they have to keep this in their, in their hearts, and they have to keep it in their mind. And really, they didn't really understand, well, what does He mean by the resurrection of the Son of Man? Obviously, they're still trying to figure out, what is this whole mission about? What is everything about? Why are we going to Jerusalem? And they didn't, they knew about the resurrection, but they didn't really know about it right. So Jesus tells them, keep this in their heart. And then they're coming down off the mountain like a spiritual journey. And I was thinking, it wasn't long after this, after they saw Jesus transfigured, that His passion occurred. We're in Lent. We're in this Lenten journey. We have the mountaintop experience, and now we go back into the valley. And what happened? Peter denied Christ. After a few days after seeing Him transfigured, he denied Him. When he was arrested, the other apostles left Him, James, and the only one that stuck with Him was John. So even after this experience, when they're in the valley, they left. But I think it had to cross their mind again what everything was about, what this mountaintop experience was, what Jesus was trying to show them. They had to be thinking about that. And I think that's part of the reason and one of the things that brought them back, right? Peter came back, and James came back, and the rest of the disciples eventually came back. But it was this glimpse of the glory that not only Jesus showed, but He said, this is what is in store for you as well. So this is what gives them the hope and what gives them to the courage to endure the tough times and endure the valley, the trips in the valley that they had. So they used this in mind to give them the strength to come back. Now, as Father alluded before Mass, If you think about it, we can have a hilltop or a mountaintop experience at every Mass. And I was thinking about this and reflecting on it. The sanctuary is elevated to try to give us this elevated view. And it's not just so everybody can see, but we climb the steps. Like if you go to the cathedral in Green Bay, there's a lot of steps. You're climbing up a mountain. You're climbing up to a mountaintop experience. And then once we're in the mountaintop, as Moses and Elijah appeared to Jesus during the Transfiguration, every Mass we hear from Moses and Elijah, the prophets, in Scripture, right? We read the Old Testament. We read the New Testament. It's God speaking to us through through His Scriptures, through His holy Word. And then in the Mass, Jesus Himself, after the words of consecration, becomes present to us. He's here, body, blood, soul, and divinity in the Eucharist. So just like Peter, James, and John, we're here on the mountain with Jesus, and we're present within Him. And the Eucharist, as Father said, is the source and summit of our faith. That language isn't chosen by accident. It's that image of, it's the summit. When you summit, you're at the peak, you're at the top, you climb this high mountain, and you're at the summit. It's like you're summiting Everest, right? It's a big thing to be there, and it's an amazing sight. It's an amazing thing to behold, and that's what the Mass is. Every Mass, we're summiting Everest. We're being there with God. He's present there amongst us, and we can behold Him. I think today, when we receive, after the words of consecration, when Father elevates the Eucharist, try to use the eyes of your soul and try to see Jesus transfigured there. We have the host. Instead of being, Jesus said, don't tell anyone. He's now revealing Himself. Try to imagine Him there, His face shining like the sun, His clothes white in the Eucharist. He's there. He's there with us again. And in the cloud of smoke from the incense, just imagine at that point in time, God's voice saying, "This is my beloved Son, with whom I am well pleased. Listen to Him."